So we wanted to make this presentation a little bit interactive and get some feedback from all of you because we're talking about behavior. We know this school year has been a bit crazy for everybody. If you could throw into the chat, which picture would best describe your school year thus far?
Bonus points if you give us like 3 words or a sentence and why you picked the picture you did. I see Kathy laughing. I'm curious which one she's going to pick here. You can pick more than one number too if you want.
For me, I would start with probably 3 because I just am getting over COVID and it's been kind of crazy with having COVID, 3 kids home, my husband, work piling up on top of it. It just makes me all want to cry. But I know, and probably want number 1. I feel a little like crazy too. But I'm hoping to end up as that smiling dog in number 4 pretty soon.
I feel like I am living. Yep, Kathy, I'm right there with you. I was just going to say I'm living, I think, between 2 and 6. So kind of that like, oh, I had a very wise person once tell me, if you don't laugh, you'll cry. And I feel like this year there's been some of those moments. And then, at the end of the day, it's definitely the 6. Like I'm just done and it's nap time. So, and it looks like people in chat are kind of agreeing. We're getting a lot of 1s and 3s, a few 4s and 6s in there. I'm excited about a 4. Someone's got a 4 in there. I think that's great. I think that's everybody's goal. And so this is just kind of a good intro for us too, to talk about communication, right? With just a picture and a number, we were able to kind of share with each other where we're at. So kind of a sneaky.
And when we look at some of that nonverbal communication too, just through our facial expressions and our gestures and our body language, we can tell a lot. Even our animals, our pets, we can tell a lot about their body language and their reactions to things. And our students are the same way.
So starting off about behavior, as we're talking about this today, I think it's really important that we just kind of always start off with kind of some of the same understandings about behavior. And one of the first things that I always like to say when we're talking about behavior is the understanding that every child wakes up wanting to be successful. I think sometimes when kids can't communicate, when kids are feeling overwhelmed, when things aren't going well, it can be really easy to say, well, they're not trying, or, this was an intentional thing. But I've never met a child that wakes up in the morning wanting their parents to be disappointed in them, wanting their teacher to be upset with them. Nobody wants to feel that way during the day. So we're coming at this presentation and every day with the idea that every child wakes up wanting to be successful. The other principle is really that all people, all of us, exhibit behavior to get what we want or need. So really, again, getting away from that idea of behavior being a negative thing. It's just what we do to get what we want or need. So we're going to give some examples as we go through today, but these are the 2 things we really want to kind of hang on to as we're talking through stuff today. So some examples of that whole concept of, what we do to get what we need. So even as an adult out in society, I display behaviors to get what I want or need. If I want to talk to somebody, I may smile at them. That's a cue that I want them to talk to me. I'm displaying that behavior to get what I want. I might wave at somebody. If I see somebody in the hallway that I'm not a fan of, somebody I don't want to talk to, I might turn my head. I might not look at them because that's me showing that I don't want to engage right now. It's not a negative behavior. It's to get what I want or need. Other things we do, we go to work, right? We call a friend when we want communication, when we want a paycheck. These are things we do to get what we need. So just like that, our students are also doing things to communicate what they want or need. So some of the examples before, again, communicating with behavior, walking on the far side of the hallway and avoiding eye contact is really communicating to other people, I don't want to talk to you right now, right? But unfortunately, some of our students are still learning some socially appropriate ways of communicating. If they don't have a good foundation and they haven't learned that their behaviors work for communication, so they haven't learned that when I walk on the far side of the hallway and avoid eye contact, people are going to leave me alone, They may do other things to get people to leave them alone. And that's still communication. It's just not what most of us are going to view as socially appropriate. So for example, until a student learns some of those more nuanced things and it's reinforced that it's going to work for them, they may instead do things like running away, avoiding someone. So who do you communicate well with? So when we're thinking about this, there are definitely people in our world that understand our communication better than others. So for example, when I give the example of, turning my head, staying on the far side of the hallway, there's some people that might pick up on that cue really well. It might be pretty obvious. There's other people who might notice the look on my face and recognize that I'm not up to talking. So sometimes my level of behavior and my level of response to things may depend on who I'm comfortable with and how well they read my cues. So this is a great question here, that if you aren't comfortable with someone, how likely are you to tell them things that make you feel self-conscious or make you feel uncomfortable? If you're really comfortable around someone, you might very well tell them, you know what, I don't want to be around you right now. Or, hey, I would really like some attention. I might call a friend. I might be able to tell them, you know what, I don't want you here by me right now. But if it's somebody that you've had conflict with in the past, or they don't read you well, it's going to be a lot harder for you to communicate with them. And this is the same for our students. So relationships are going to be key in everything that we're talking about today. So students know that you're willing to listen to them, you're going to read their behavioral cues, and they're not going to get in trouble for trying to communicate with you.
So one of the things that I wanted to bring up is relates to communication process called LAMP, or language acquisition through motor planning. Some of you may be familiar with the Words for Life app. Sometimes it's referred to as the LAMP app, but LAMP is actually more of a therapy technique than it is an app. The Words for Life is the app. So one of the principles of language acquisition through motor planning is this idea of readiness to learn. And the reason why I bring it up is because if we have a student that isn't in that optimal place, that state, then it's going to be very difficult to get them to communicate, whether that's through a communication app, if they have complex communication needs, or if it's verbally. We really need to take this into consideration. So the first area in this readiness to learn is that the individual is in a state that is optimal for learning. We need to consider the person, we need to consider the task, and we need to consider the environment. So their arousal level, if they come in the morning and they're really sleepy because maybe they didn't have a good night of sleep, who knows what was going on at home, or maybe they don't sleep through the night very well, is that going to be the ideal time to do some more difficult tasks? Or do they maybe need some time to wake up, and then you're going to present something that may be a little bit more challenging for them? We need to think about the difficulty of the task. So is it at a skill level that's really hard? We think when we're thinking about teaching reading, we teach reading, maybe with the teacher in a small group, and we're working at a higher reading level as we're working on those skills. But when a student is self-selecting books, we want them to pick books that are a little less challenging and they can read for fluency. And so, we have to think about the task that they're doing as well. And then the environment. Some students, we might think about gym class or Phi Ed tends to be a difficult time for some of our students because you've got the echoing of the large room and maybe basketballs bouncing. And so that may not be an ideal place where we're going to expect them to be able to communicate their wants and needs really well, because they are competing with all those environmental challenges that they're trying to process as well. So we want to also then take into consideration, some of those things I just talked about: sensory processing differences, their arousal or modulation. Some kids I know, like when they're really young and they're coming in from maybe early childhood or 4K, and they're used to getting a nap, then suddenly they're in full day kindergarten, and in the afternoon, it's a real struggle to get them to do anything. So again, that might be a time where you see more of those behaviors behavior is happening, and you need to take that timing into consideration along with their arousal level. Emotion, their motivation for doing the task. We all need to be motivated. I just had an SLP ask me in a meeting the other day. She was wondering, how do I get the student to participate in non-preferred tasks? Well, we all need to be motivated to do things we don't prefer. I don't necessarily want to do laundry, but I might tell myself, okay, I can have a piece of chocolate after I get that laundry folded. Or I get to turn on my favorite, normally what I do, I turn on my favorite TV show while I'm sitting there folding laundry to help pass the time. We all need motivators. We just don't realize that we're using them. And a lot of our students need that motivation as well. They're not always intrinsically motivated to communicate all the time. And then again, that task, taking that task into consideration.
I think it's really interesting as we are talking how much of this pertains to us as well, right? So a lot of times we forget that our students are experiencing a lot of the same things we are, but maybe dealing with more struggles than we are with it. So this is one of my favorite quotes and came from my, EBD days, but really focusing in teaching, you can't do the Bloom stuff until you take care of the Maslow stuff. Basically meaning we can't get students in a classroom and expecting them to learn until they are feeling safe and have all of their needs met. And that includes knowing that someone's going to be listening to them. They're regulated, they're ready to learn. And unfortunately, we have students that we need to back up a little bit and work on those things. And like Jennifer was just talking in the gym, right? If there's all those sensory things going on and those students aren't feeling safe and regulated, we can't be expecting them to learn in that environment.
So this is a quote from Lance McLemore. He is a gentleman that has autism and uses an AAC communication device. And you can see the whole blog post in the link there. So I'll just read it out loud. As an autistic person, social interaction is challenging under the best of circumstances. Add in a sensory disturbance and it becomes more difficult. How could I communicate my best when all I wanted to do was crawl out of my skin? How could I communicate when I was so exhausted from trying not to look like I was crazy? Just a good reminder, I think, that there's a lot going on. You think of that infographic with the tip of the iceberg. What you're seeing is just the tip. There's all that stuff below the iceberg that's going on that we really need to take into consideration.
That quote is also a great time to go back and really discuss that relationship piece, because if you're not comfortable with a person, how likely are you going to be able to, communicate to them how you're feeling? When this quote is saying, how could I communicate when I was exhausted from trying not to look like I was crazy? So if you were more comfortable with someone, likely you're going to not try to hide those things and what's going on with you as much, which then is going to make that communication easier. So what can we do to help? So we've been talking about behavior, we're talking about communication, we're talking about, the interplay, what happens when students can't communicate, but we really also want to talk about what can we do to help support. So I always kind of like bringing this up. So we have options to support students. We can adapt their environment, we can assist them with things, and we can teach them things. The question comes in a lot of times of what do we typically start with? And I think in general, it can be really easy to jump in with that assist piece. When a student can't do something, we're going to assist them. We're going to do it with them. We're going to do it for them. Unfortunately, a lot of times that is going to decrease student independence. So if we were teaching a student to read, we wouldn't immediately go to assisting in reading for them. We would teach them how to read. We would adapt the reading materials to make it easier. And, in order to teach and process, we may be doing some assisting in there, but that's not where we're going to go first. And we're going to do as little of that as possible. When it comes to communication or working on communicating behaviors and needs, a lot of times we really tend to jump into that assist piece before we go back and take the time to teach and adapt. So we're going to take a little bit of time and talk about why that's important, and then talk about some tools and techniques that we can do to really help students. So one of the reasons we're going to look always at teaching first and then adapting is we really want to focus on independence. So independence as a definition means free from outside control or support, the state of being independent. Some synonyms for that are self-sufficient, self-dependence, and self-reliance. So think about the toddler, right? And we always kind of laugh because, you have those moments of, I do it, I can do it. I want to tie my shoe. I want to zip my jacket. And it might take them 7 times as long, but boy, howdy, they want to do it. And so this whole feeling of independence and wanting to do things for ourselves, we all start experiencing it at a really early age. For students who can't communicate clearly what they want or need, often that independence part is something that they start struggling with being taken away from them. If they can't communicate what they need, they can't control their world. They can't control around them. They can't control how people are interacting with them. So this communication becomes huge when it comes to a student being independent and therefore displaying more positive behaviors.
I just want to jump in and quickly say that I think because of this, we see a lot of learned helplessness. And with that learned helplessness, then what happens is when you have somebody who comes in and wants them to be more independent, then you sometimes see those behaviors because they've gotten so used to somebody doing everything for them and they don't want to do it for themselves anymore. I mean, sort of the other end of the spectrum, but that when we are doing what you said on this previous slide and we're doing too much assisting and we're not doing enough adapting or teaching, we sort of create that other end of the spectrum. And then it creates problems for future teachers or paraprofessionals who are working with that student. And sometimes you see this with families where, and I don't judge because I have 3 kids of my own. And sometimes I just have to zip up that jacket because we need to get out the door. So I totally get that end of things. But I hear that a lot from school staff. Well, they don't do that at home. Their parents just do everything for them. But I think we need to, I think we need to work with families, and that speaks to how we can help with some of, going back to this last slide, helping families make some of those adaptations and learn how to teach their child to become more independent at home, which will then carry over into the school environment as well.
I think tying into that as well, there's also the classroom piece. When you're talking about not having time to let your, child tie their shoes at home, I think about a classroom too with our students that are in, regular education classrooms, and the teachers have a certain amount of time to get through materials and a certain amount of time to ask questions and get responses. They can really feel a pull to keep moving and not take some of that wait time, right? Because wait time can take a while and be really difficult. And so when you're talking with classroom teachers and stuff too, I always feel like it's really important to acknowledge that, they're feeling like they're limited on time as well. And so it is easier to jump in and do some of that teaching or to do some of that assisting instead of working backwards. So really coming in from that, how can we all teach? What adaptations are possible? How can we support so that the student can truly do this?
And making some of the modifications and making sure those are written into the IEP so that maybe that student needs shortened assignments. And I always say quality over quantity. So if they are in that regular education setting, can they do a shortened assignment in some way so that they have that ability to really work on that independence and getting, just even if it's a shorter amount of work, it's being done more independently and well.
I think this is also a really great point. And as we're moving into this slide too, is to talk about when we have educational assistants who are wonderful humans working with students, but the importance too of empowering them to teach students and to work with the adaptations. I feel like a lot of times, sometimes our educational assistants are feeling like their job in the classroom is to assist and to do it with the student instead of teaching the student how to do it or supporting those adaptations. So this becomes a much bigger discussion in the students' world. So what happens if we're not doing that well? So while it's difficult to step back and teach and adapt because it takes more time on the front, right? When students are feeling where they can't be independent, where students are not being independent, they're going to start feeling helpless, frustrated, dependent, embarrassed, disappointed. Okay. Think about, your second grader, your third grader who can't do it on their own, right? Like picture your toddler when they can't tie their shoes on their own and they want to do it, how frustrated they feel, right? When somebody has to ask for help for something that they feel like they should be able to do themselves. And then especially as you're getting up into the junior high and high school years, that embarrassment piece, right? That's the independence on the next level. We've got that like toddler, I do it, right? And then we've got that junior high, I want to be my own person. And now I need this person to help me. So when a student is feeling helpless, frustrated, dependent, embarrassed, disappointed, we see behaviors that we would consider unexpected or negative behaviors showing up pretty frequently. And that can tie in then again with the lack of communication. If I can't communicate that I need this and I'm dependent on you, now what?
Or I'm embarrassed to communicate that I can't do this independently. I think that you see that maybe at the older grade levels where it's coming out as maybe silliness and they're goofing around because they're embarrassed that they can't do it and they don't want to say anything in front of everybody, or they don't have that relationship with that teacher to ask.
I see a lot of what gets viewed as rudeness at that point. So the student is communicating that they want you to leave them alone. They don't want the help. And it comes across as rudeness when it's not really, they don't want help. They don't want to do the task. They're communicating with you that they're not comfortable with you offering help right then. Right. And so, yeah, you can see that silliness to, distract away from it. And you can also see rudeness towards the people who are trying to help. And that can become a really dangerous combination as students are getting older because they start pushing away people that are going to help them.
So not something that we've talked about, Cassie, but what I think would be interesting to think about is during the pandemic when we were doing more virtual learning and we had more inconspicuous ways of indicating that you needed help. I think that we saw some students who those behaviors probably went down. They became more engaged because there were back channel chats with the teacher where they could ask for help. Or maybe they had their environment was changing, better, more flexible seating, or were more comfortable in their home. So I think it's interesting to really think about how the pandemic and the change in environment and some of those new ways of communicating for the better for some students, really benefited how they were doing, and the virtual learning was a blessing to them, whereas some people really struggled. So, just keeping some of those things in mind as we think back to what went well during the pandemic and that virtual learning, and can we find some ways to bring some of those supports now back into the classroom?
I would agree. How do your students communicate? And if they had more communication during that period, how can we tie it in? Absolutely. So if, this is just a really good kind of outline of what we just talked about. And this is often when I'm talking with groups about, why do we need to look at behavior and communication and, taking the time on the front end to have these conversations, because a lot of times, unexpected behaviors and the way they're being communicated, a lot of times we start dealing with them at the end, right? When the student's in trouble, that's when we're dealing with them. So it's important to look back at this. When a student is feeling dependent, helpless, embarrassed, what are they going to do? They're going to act out. They're going to avoid that environment where they feel uncomfortable. They're going to try to save face by being rude, acting out. And then when that happens, we're losing instructional time. And oftentimes these are the students who need that instructional time the most, right? So this is a very kind of dangerous flow that can happen if we're not listening to our students and giving them ways to communicate that they're upset. And as an adult, right, in our world, there are times we do this. So if you are sitting in a meeting and you lost your notes you were supposed to have, right? Your organizational system was not great that day. Now you have to ask for another copy of those in front of the meeting. And now you're embarrassed, right? What are you going to do? Well, most of us are going to try to deal with that embarrassment and go, just ask for the copy and kind of suck it up. But if we're having a bad day, we may also make a joke about it. We may also avoid getting that copy of the notes, and we'll just deal with it the best we can and not do as good of a job as we could, right? And all of those things are going to cause us to not do our jobs as well. We do these things also. And I always want to come back to that, because this isn't a student thing. This isn't a child thing. This is a human thing. We all feel this way. We all will do things to avoid feeling that way. And there's always an outcome to it. So when we're talking about behaviors, really giving students ways to communicate appropriately and recognize what they're trying to tell us.